The high society of Boston's undead elite thrives on absolute terrifying perfection. So when Nathaniel Croft, the ruthless vampire king of the eastern seaboard, looked at Josephine, a plus-size, deeply human archivist, sweating in a cheap taffeta gown, and mocked, "If you dance this waltz without stumbling, I'll marry you," the ballroom erupted in cruel, mocking laughter. It was supposed to be a humiliating joke to break her spirit, but Josephine didn't run away crying. She stepped forward, took his cold hand and sealed a bloody inescapable pact. The grand ballroom of the Rosecliff Annex in Newport, Rhode Island smelled heavily of night-blooming jasmine, expensive vintage champagne, and the faint coppery tang of human blood. Josephine Miller pressed her back against the cool marble of a gilded pillar, praying to whatever higher power was listening that the shadows would swallow her whole. Josephine was not supposed to be here. She was an archivist, a mortal employee on the payroll of the Croft estate, hired strictly for her unparalleled knowledge of 17th-century Dutch antiquities. She spent her days in the dusty, temperature-controlled sub-basements of the Croft Library, cataloguing stolen masterworks that the immortal elite had hoarded for centuries. But tonight was the Winter Solstice Gala, the most important night in the vampiric social calendar, and the head curator had fallen mysteriously ill, forcing Josephine to deliver a set of provenance documents directly to the estate's master. She felt like a gargoyle hiding among marble angels. The vampires that glided across the parquet dance floor were paralyzingly beautiful. They possessed the kind of razor-sharp, hollow-cheeked, emaciated perfection that graced the covers of high-fashion magazines. And then there was Josephine. She was a mortal woman, soft and round, wearing a US size 18 body that took up space in a room where humans were expected to be invisible, decorative, or consumable. Her dress, a panicked last-minute purchase from a mid-tier department store in Providence, was made of a stifling navy taffeta that pinched her under the arms and dug mercilessly into her waist. She could feel the judging, predatory eyes of the immortals raking over her curves, their heightened senses practically smelling her insecurity. To them, flesh was only valuable if it was attached to a pulsing, delicate vein. A body like hers, plump, heavy, undeniably human and imperfect, was an offense to their aesthetic sensibilities. "Look at it!" A voice sneered, soft but perfectly audible to the sharp-eared crowd. Josephine flinched. Standing a few feet away was Camilla, a vampire of terrifying pedigree, wearing a backless, custom-made Vera Wang gown that clung to her impossibly thin frame like liquid silver. Camilla was holding a crystal flute of a dark, viscous liquid, her crimson lips curled into a sneer of pure disgust. "I didn't know the caterers were allowing the livestock to roam free," Camilla remarked to her companion, an equally flawless vampire who chuckled the sound like breaking glass. Honestly, the sheer bulk of the creature, how does it even move without collapsing under its own weight? Josephine felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck, staining her cheeks. She gripped the leather portfolio containing the provenance of a stolen Rembrandt so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Don't cry," she ordered herself. "Do not give them the satisfaction. You are here to do a job." She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills back in Pawtucket were piling up, and the Croft estate paid 10 times the standard rate for discretion. Josephine swallowed the lump in her throat and tried to make herself smaller, wishing the navy taffeta could act as an invisibility cloak, but her movement caught the eye of the one predator in the room she had been desperately trying to avoid. The crowd parted in a sudden, reverent wave. The low hum of string instruments seemed to quiet. Nathaniel Croft, the vampire king of the eastern seaboard, was crossing the room. Nathaniel was a terrifying vision of masculine authority. He had ruled the New England territories since the late 1800s, a ruthless tactician masquerading as a modern billionaire. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that highlighted the broad span of his shoulders and his predatory grace. His eyes, the color of crushed obsidian, were fixed entirely on Josephine. He moved with the terrifying stillness of a shark in dark water. As he approached, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Camilla immediately puffed up her chest, stepping forward to intercept him, her voice dropping an octave into a sultry purr. "My Lord Croft, we were just discussing the tragic decline in the estate's hiring standards." Nathaniel didn't even look at Camilla. He stopped directly in front of Josephine. He was so close she could smell his cologne bergamot, old paper, and ice. He looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over her flushed face, her unruly chestnut curls, and the cheap, straining fabric of her dress. "Miss Miller," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, dark velvet that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "You are trembling. Do our guests frighten you, or is it simply the exertion of standing A collective snicker rippled through the gathered elite. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was mocking her. The king himself was pausing his night to publicly humiliate the fat human archivist. "I brought the documents you requested, Mr. Croft," Josephine managed to say, her voice shaking only slightly as she held out the leather portfolio. "The Rembrandt provenance. I will take my leave now." She tried to push past him, desperate to escape the suffocating ballroom, but Nathaniel shifted his weight, blocking her path with effortless dominance. Leaving so soon, Nathaniel's lips curved into a cruel, devastating smile. "But the night has just begun, and the orchestra is about to play." The string quartet in the raised balcony began to tune their instruments, signaling the start of the Midnight Waltz. In vampiric society, the Midnight Waltz was not a mere dance. It was an exhibition of power, agility, and immortal stamina. "Mr. Croft, please," Josephine whispered, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "I don't belong here. I just want to go home." Nathaniel tilted his head, his black eyes glinting with a dangerous mixture of boredom and malice. He had lived for 400 years, and his primary entertainment came from breaking things, specifically breaking the pride of those who thought they had any right to occupy his space. He saw the defiance buried deep in Josephine's hazel eyes, masked by her embarrassment, and it irritated him. How dared this heavy, ordinary mortal look at him with anything other than absolute terror? "You mortals are so tedious," Nathaniel declared loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear. "You clutter my halls with your sweat and your anxiety. You complain of fatigue when you have done nothing but stand in the corner like an overgrown wallflower." Camilla laughed, stepping closer to Nathaniel's side. She couldn't dance if she tried, Nathaniel. The poor thing would likely trip over her own mass and crush the floorboards, send her back to the basement where the dust can hide her. Josephine's vision blurred with unshed tears. She had spent her entire life dealing with comments like this, from high school gym teachers, from doctors who blamed every ailment on her BMI, from strangers on the subway. But hearing it here in a room of immortal apex predators felt like a public execution. She looked up at Nathaniel, her hazel eyes meeting his obsidian ones. "Take the portfolio, sir, please." Nathaniel looked at the portfolio, then back at her. A wicked, arrogant idea formed in his mind. In vampire lore, words spoken in front of the court were binding contracts. The immortals called it the veritas vinculum, the truth bond. If an immortal made a public vow, the ancient magic of their bloodline forced them to honor it. It was a failsafe to prevent the kings from breaking treaties. Nathaniel knew this. The whole room knew this. He decided to make a joke so cruel, so utterly impossible, that it would force this human to run weeping from the room, proving his absolute dominance, and entertaining his guests in one fell swoop. Nathaniel didn't take the portfolio. Instead, he extended his pale, perfectly manicured hand toward Josephine. "I have a proposition, Miss Miller," Nathaniel said, his voice booming over the silence of the ballroom. "A test of your fortitude. They say humans are resilient. Let us see." Josephine stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a coiled viper. "What do you mean?" "The orchestra is about to play the Danster song," Nathaniel announced. The room collectively gasped. The Danster song was a notoriously aggressive Viennese waltz played at a breakneck tempo that tested the limits of even vampiric reflexes. "If you take my hand and dance this waltz with me, if you can keep up without stumbling, without stopping, without begging for mercy." He paused, a dark, theatrical smirk playing on his lips. He looked at her soft, heavy body, completely convinced of her physical incompetence. "If you dance this waltz," Nathaniel laughed, a cold, ringing sound, "I'll marry you, here and now, under the laws of the night." The ballroom erupted. Vampires threw their heads back in raucous, mocking laughter. Camilla covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with mirth. The idea was absurd. Marry a human, marry a fat, plain, sweating archivist. It was the ultimate insult. Nathaniel was betting his crown, his eternal life, and his empire on the absolute certainty that Josephine Miller would fail. Josephine stood frozen. The laughter washed over her like battery acid. She looked at Nathaniel's arrogant, beautiful face. He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for her to drop her headburst into tears and flee into the Rhode Island snow, a pathetic joke for them to talk about for the next century. A deep, dormant spark of pure, unadulterated rage ignited in Josephine's chest. What the immortals didn't know, what Nathaniel's extensive background checks into her academic history had failed to uncover, was that before her father died and the medical bills bankrupted her family, Josephine had practically been raised on the hardwood floors of a competitive ballroom dance studio in Providence. Her weight had never hindered her grace. It had only hindered the biased judges who refused to award a plus-size girl the gold medal. She knew the Viennese waltz. She knew the rhythm. the physics of momentum, the brutal, breathless stamina it required. The laughter continued to ring in her ears. If I run, Josephine thought, her jaw tightening. I am exactly what they think I am. She placed the leather portfolio onto a nearby silver tray. She wiped her sweating palms on the sides of her cheap navy taffeta skirt. And then, lifting her chin, Josephine Miller reached out and placed her warm human hand firmly into the freezing marble-like palm of the Vampire King. "Lead, your majesty," she said, her voice dead steady. The laughter in the ballroom cut off so abruptly. It was as if someone had pulled a plug. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathaniel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes widening in genuine shock at the contact. Her hand was so warm, so undeniably alive. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into a mask of cruel determination. "Foolish mortal," he hissed under his breath. "I will break your legs before the second chorus." "Try it," Josephine whispered back. Nathaniel snapped his free hand in the air, a sharp, commanding gesture toward the balcony. The conductor raised his baton, his face pale with shock. With a violent slash of his arm, the orchestra launched into the danse de sang. It didn't begin slowly. The music exploded into the room with a frantic, aggressive three-quarter time, the cellos aggressively soaring at their strings, the violins screaming. It was a tempest of sound. Nathaniel pulled Josephine into the frame with terrifying force. His right hand clamped onto her back, his fingers digging into the taffeta just below her shoulder blade. It was a grip designed to intimidate, to overpower. He stepped forward on the downbeat, driving straight into her space, intending to bowl her over backward in the very first second of the dance. But Josephine didn't fall. Years of muscle memory, buried under stress and archivist dust, flared to life. As Nathaniel drove forward, Josephine seamlessly executed a perfect reverse turn, shifting her weight flawlessly and stepping back with a lightness that defied gravity. She absorbed his aggressive momentum and redirected it, her body curving into the classic ballroom frame. She kept her head snapped sharply to the left, her posture impeccably straight, refusing to look him in the eye. Focusing entirely on the line of dance, Nathaniel's eyes widened. He immediately increased the tempo, pulling her into a rapid series of natural turns, spinning her down the length of the grand ballroom. The centrifugal force was immense. The room blurred into a streak of gold marble and shocked, immortal faces. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Josephine's feet flew across the polished parquet floor. The cheap navy dress billowed around her legs. She was heavy, yes, but that weight gave her an anchor against Nathaniel's supernatural speed. Where a lighter, frailer human would have been whipped around like a rag doll, Josephine used her mass to ground the frame, matching his terrifying power with deep, sweeping strides. "You're hiding something, little archivist," Nathaniel growled softly, the sound vibrating against her collarbone as they spun past the enormous crystal chandelier. He was no longer smiling. The joke had evaporated. "I'm not hiding anything," Josephine replied, her breathing perfectly measured. "You just never bothered to look." Infuriated, Nathaniel decided to end it. He gripped her tighter, his thumb bruising her spine, and threw them into a fleckle, a notoriously difficult rapid spin in the dead center of the floor that required both partners to rotate on a single axis without traveling. It was designed to induce extreme dizziness. Executed at vampire speed, it usually caused humans to black out. The world spun into a dizzying vortex. The faces of the vampires, Camilla's horrified gasp, the wide-eyed stares of the elite became a smeared canvas of color. Josephine felt the blood rushing to her head, the nausea building in her throat. The physical strain was agonizing. Her calves burned, and the corset of her cheap dress was constricting her lungs, starving her of oxygen. "Don't stumble," she chanted in her mind. "Do not give him the satisfaction." She engaged her core, locking her frame against his rigid arms. She matched his footwork perfectly, her sensible black heels crossing and uncrossing in a blur. She felt Nathaniel's freezing chest heaving slightly against her own. Even he was exerting effort to maintain this unnatural speed. He looked down at her, his obsidian eyes locking onto her flushed, determined face. For the first time in 4 centuries, Nathaniel Croft felt a spike of genuine awe. The woman in his arms was not a delicate, wilting flower. She was a force of nature. The soft flesh he had mocked was wrapped around a spine of pure steel. The music swelled to its aggressive, chaotic crescendo. The violins shrieked a final, desperate high note. With a brutal, sweeping movement, Nathaniel threw Josephine into a deep, dramatic dip, just as the final chord struck. He held her suspended inches from the marble floor. The music stopped. The ballroom was dead silent. Josephine was panting her chest, heaving a bead of sweat tracing the curve of her neck. But her feet had never crossed improperly. She had not tripped. She had not stumbled. She had survived the danse de sang. She looked up into Nathaniel's face. He was staring at her frozen, his mouth slightly parted. The mockery was entirely gone, replaced by a dark, terrifying realization. "I believe," Josephine gasped out, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "The dance is over, my king." A low rumble of horrified whispers broke out across the room. The vampires understood what had just happened. The veritas vinculum had been invoked. Nathaniel had made a public vow to the ancient magic of his bloodline. Nathaniel slowly pulled Josephine upright. He didn't release her hand. The temperature in the room dropped until frost began to form on the edges of the champagne flutes. He looked at Camilla, who was pale with terror, and then back to the breathless plus-size human who had just checkmated the most powerful immortal on the eastern seaboard. A dark, dangerous fire ignited in Nathaniel's eyes. He lifted Josephine's hand to his mouth, his fangs grazing her knuckles in a kiss that sealed her fate. "Well played, my queen," Nathaniel whispered, and the magic of the blood vow snapped shut around them both like a steel trap. The silence in the Rosecliff Annex ballroom was no longer merely quiet. It possessed a suffocating physical weight pressing down on the shoulders of every immortal present. The ancient magic of the veritas vinculum didn't care about the social hierarchies of the undead elite, nor did it respect the panicked, regretful calculations undoubtedly racing through the mind of the vampire king. As Nathaniel's fangs grazed the knuckles of Josephine's warm, trembling hand, a visceral shockwave of energy violently ruptured the heavy scent of jasmine and vintage champagne. It began as a faint crimson luminescence bleeding from the polished parquet floorboards directly beneath their feet. The light rapidly intensified, spiraling upward in thick, ethereal ribbons of blood-red magic that coiled tightly around Nathaniel's tailored midnight blue tuxedo and Josephine's strained, sweat-dampened navy taffeta dress. The magic was ancient, absolute, and utterly undeniable. Josephine gasped, her hazel eyes widening in sheer terror as the searing, blinding light wrapped tightly around her left ring finger, sinking deeply into her skin like a branding iron before vanishing beneath the surface. She expected agony, but instead she felt an overwhelming, terrifying surge of cold power flood her human veins. Nathaniel staggered backward, physically repelled by the completion of the magical contract. He stared at his own left hand, where a matching ring of phantom crimson light had briefly flared and disappeared. The absolute undeniable truth of the situation crashed over him with the force of a falling grand piano. He, Nathaniel Croft, the ruthless, undisputed ruler of the eastern seaboard, the immortal tactician who had slaughtered warlords and decimated rival covens, was now irrevocably bound in holy matrimony to a mortal archivist from Pawtucket. And not just any mortal, a heavy-set, profoundly ordinary woman who had just publicly humiliated him by surviving the dangerous Waltz. The arrogant smirk that had previously defined his handsome, aristocratic features was completely obliterated, replaced by a mask of pale, rigidly controlled horror. The hundreds of vampires surrounding them remained utterly paralyzed, their sharp, predatory faces completely drained of their usual haughty amusement. Nobody dared to breathe. Nobody dared to move. To break the silence was to invite the wrath of a king who had just accidentally trapped himself in an eternal cage of his own careless design. "This is a trick!" Camilla suddenly shrieked, her voice shattering the suffocating silence like a thrown brick through a stained glass window. The incredibly thin, terrifyingly beautiful vampire lunged forward from the edge of the crowd, her silver designer gown glittering aggressively under the massive crystal chandeliers. Her face was contorted into a hideous, feral mask of pure jealousy and unadulterated rage. "She cheated the human livestock, must possess some pathetic stolen talisman. Nathaniel, you cannot possibly let this stand. Look at her. Look at the repulsive, sweating bulk of the creature. She is an absolute abomination to our kind." Camilla's perfectly manicured hands morphed her fingernails, elongating into jagged, terrifying talons as she launched herself violently toward Josephine, intending to rip the mortal woman's throat out and sever the newly forged magical bond before it could fully settle into their respective bloodlines. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut and instinctively threw her arms up to protect her face expecting the agonizing, tearing bite of immortal fangs. But the terrifying impact never came. A deafening, explosive crack echoed violently through the massive ballroom, followed immediately by the sickening crunch of shattering bone. Josephine cautiously opened one eye and lowered her trembling arms. Nathaniel was standing firmly positioned directly in front of her, forming an impenetrable, terrifying wall of midnight blue fabric and furious immortal muscle. He held Camilla suspended a full foot off the marble floor by her delicate, slender throat. Camilla was violently choking her legs, kicking frantically in the empty air, her silver dress thrashing wildly as she clawed desperately at Nathaniel's unyielding grip. The Vampire King's obsidian eyes were completely devoid of mercy, glowing with a demonic, terrifying intensity that made the surrounding crowd of elite predators shrink backward in absolute groveling fear. "You forget yourself, Camilla," Nathaniel hissed, his deep velvet voice resonating with an incredibly dark, lethal authority that rattled the champagne glasses on the nearby catering tables. "You dare to raise your hand against the newly crowned queen of the eastern seaboard. You dare to question the ancient sacred magic of the Veritas Vinculum. I made a vow in front of this entire court. The magic has accepted the outcome. She danced the waltz. She did not stumble. She did not break. And therefore the bond is absolute." He tightened his grip significantly, causing Camilla to emit a pathetic wheezing gasp. "If anyone in this room so much as looks at my wife with anything less than absolute groveling reverence, I will personally strip the flesh from their immortal bones and leave their screaming remains for the rising sun. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" A chorus of terrified, hastily muttered agreements violently rippled through the gathered crowd. Nathaniel disgustedly threw Camilla to the floor, where she collapsed into a weeping, humiliated heap of silver silk and heavily bruised ego. Nathaniel slowly turned to face Josephine. His chest was heavily rising and falling, betraying the immense, barely contained rage boiling beneath his meticulously maintained facade. He extended his freezing marble-like hand toward her once again, but this time there was absolutely no mocking arrogance in his gesture. It was a rigid, unbreakable command. "Come with me, Josephine," he ordered softly, though the tone left entirely no room for negotiation. "We have a tremendous amount of urgent matters to discuss, and we are no longer providing free entertainment for these pathetic sycophants." Josephine, still violently trembling from the adrenaline and the terrifying proximity of death, silently placed her warm hand into his. Without casting a single backward glance at the hundreds of stunned, silent vampires, Nathaniel forcefully led her out of the grand ballroom, sweeping through the massive oak double doors and plunging them into the dimly lit, profoundly silent corridors of the Croft Estate's heavily restricted private wing. The private corridors were heavily adorned with priceless 17th-century tapestries and dimly glowing gaslight sconces that cast long, ominous shadows across the thick, imported Persian rugs. Josephine struggled significantly to keep pace with Nathaniel's terrifyingly long, predatory strides. Her sensible black heels clicked frantically against the floorboards, and the cheap navy taffeta of her dress furiously rustled in the oppressive silence. She felt utterly ridiculous, entirely out of place and deeply terrified. She was a simple, debt-ridden archivist who spent her weekends clipping coupons and calling her sick mother in Rhode Island, and now she was magically bound to a centuries-old apex predator who casually choked his peers for mere insults. When they finally reached a pair of towering, intricately carved mahogany doors, Nathaniel shoved them violently open and dragged her into his private study. The room was an incredibly overwhelming testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and ruthless dominance. Massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, groaning under the immense weight of leather-bound grimoires, ancient historical texts, and stolen royal decrees. A massive roaring fire violently crackled in a huge black marble fireplace, casting dancing orange light across a sprawling antique mahogany desk covered in meticulously organized financial ledgers and modern laptops. Nathaniel immediately released her hand, pacing aggressively like a trapped, furious panther across the priceless antique rug. He violently raked his pale hands through his impeccably styled dark hair, destroying the perfect coiffure. "Do you have any idea?" Nathaniel suddenly snarled, whirling around to glare violently at her. "What you have just done? Do you comprehend the sheer unadulterated catastrophe you have just unleashed upon my entire existence?" Josephine's dormant, long-suppressed anger, fueled by years of fat phobia and constant grinding humiliation, suddenly flared back to brilliant life. She squarely planted her feet, refusing to shrink away from his terrifying anger. "What I have done," she yelled back, her voice echoing loudly off the ancient bookshelves. "You were the one who made the ridiculous, arrogant wager. You were the one who thought publicly humiliating a fat human woman would be a hilarious, entertaining party trick. You invoked the binding magic because you were completely, utterly certain that my physical size made me an incompetent, pathetic klutz. This is entirely your fault, your majesty." She spat the royal title with profound, dripping sarcasm, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. The heavy taffeta dress violently crinkled, but she stood tall, radiating an undeniable, furious dignity that left the ancient vampire momentarily stunned. Nathaniel froze completely, his dark, dangerous eyes widening slightly at her unexpected, blatant insubordination. Nobody, immortal or human, had ever spoken to him with such tremendous, suicidal disrespect in over 3 centuries. For a brief, terrifying fraction of a second, he looked as though he might cross the room and snap her fragile neck. Instead, a strange, incredibly dark amusement suddenly flashed through his obsidian eyes. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the edge of his massive mahogany desk, crossing his long legs at the ankles. "You have a shockingly sharp tongue for a mortal archivist," Nathaniel observed quietly, his deep velvet voice dropping to a dangerously intimate, mesmerizing timbre. "I assumed your entire existence consisted of quietly inhaling dust and obediently cataloguing stolen Dutch paintings. It seems your personnel file was profoundly, entirely inadequate." "My personnel file only covers my academic credentials and my typing speed, Mr. Croft," Josephine replied coldly, aggressively attempting to smooth down the painfully tight bodice of her navy dress. "It deliberately omits my extensive background in competitive ballroom dancing, and it certainly does not detail my extreme, overwhelming intolerance for arrogant, condescending bullies. Now please tell me how we reverse this tremendous magical mistake so I can return to my basement. And you can return to your ridiculously beautiful, blood-sucking socialites." She gestured frustratedly toward the heavy mahogany doors, desperate to escape the suffocating intensity of his undivided attention. She needed to go back to Pawtucket, pay the overdue electric bill, and pretend this entire night was just a deeply traumatic, stress-induced hallucination. Nathaniel let out a short, harsh laugh, devoid of any genuine humor. "Reverse it? My dear, infuriatingly stubborn woman, you clearly do not comprehend the absolute, terrifying finality of the veritas vinculum. It is not a modern legal contract that can be annulled by expensive lawyers." He pushed off the heavy desk and slowly, deliberately closed the distance between them until he was towering directly over her. Josephine instinctively tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, refusing to back down under his intimidating proximity. "The magic demands absolute, undeniable fulfillment. By successfully completing the dance, you triggered the marital clause. We are magically bound. If I attempt to publicly reject you, or if I deliberately banish you from my estate, the ancient magic will view it as a broken vow." Josephine frowned deeply, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. "And what exactly happens if the magic decides you broke the vow? Do you lose your crown? Do you get demoted to a lesser territory?" Nathaniel's beautiful, aristocratic face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated grimness. "If the vow is broken," he stated completely flatly, the terrible truth of their situation finally coming to light, "the magic will violently and instantly incinerate my heart inside my chest. I will turn into a pile of useless, smoldering ash before the sun rises." A profound, suffocating silence descended heavily upon the dark study. Josephine felt the blood rapidly drain from her flushed face. She was suddenly and entirely responsible for the continued existence of the most powerful, terrifying entity on the eastern seaboard. "However," Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping to an incredibly dark, deadly whisper, "the situation is significantly more complicated than merely surviving each other's company. The veritas vinculum requires the marriage to be fully, properly sealed, according to ancient vampiric traditions." He reached out his freezing fingers gently, almost hesitantly brushing against the warm, soft curve of her cheek. Josephine forcefully suppressed a sudden shiver at the sheer, unnatural cold of his skin. "Within exactly 3 nights before the stroke of midnight, on the 3rd day, we must perform the sacred blood exchange ceremony. If we fail to complete this final mandatory ritual, the magic will consider the union fraudulent." Josephine slapped his cold hand away aggressively, her eyes burning with tremendous, undeniable panic. A blood exchange? You mean I have to let you bite me? I have to drink your blood? Nathaniel nodded slowly, his expression entirely unreadable and deeply shadowed by the flickering orange firelight. Precisely. And if we do not complete this ceremony, it isn't just my life that the magic will violently claim as penalty. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a frightening intensity. If the bond fails, Josephine, the ancient magic will brutally incinerate us both. We are permanently trapped together. Josephine stumbled backward, her sensible heels catching on the thick Persian rug. She collapsed into a heavy leather armchair, her mind racing with the horrific, unbelievable reality of her situation. She was no longer just an employee. She was a hostage to ancient, unforgiving magic. If she ran away to protect herself, she would die in flames. If she stayed, she would be forced to permanently bind herself to a monster who had mocked her weight and tried to publicly humiliate her for his own sick entertainment. There has to be another way, Josephine whispered, burying her face in her hands. There has to be a loophole. Some dusty old grimoire in your massive library must hold a counterspell. You are the king. You have unlimited resources. Fix this. I assure you, if there were a way out, I would have already taken it, Nathaniel replied brutally, walking back to his desk and pouring a heavy glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He offered it to her, but she vehemently shook her head. He drank it himself in one swift, aggressive motion. The Veritas Vinculum was designed by the original founders of the vampiric courts, specifically to prevent political betrayal. It is ironclad. We have 72 hours to prepare for the blood exchange ceremony. During this time, you will remain here in the heavily guarded private wing. You will not contact the outside world. You will not attempt to flee. You are kidnapping me, Josephine stated flatly, lowering her hands to glare at him. This is a kidnapping, magically mandated or not. I am protecting you, Nathaniel corrected sharply, slamming the crystal glass down on the mahogany desk. Do you think Camilla is the only one who wants you dead? The moment word spreads that a human, a profoundly ordinary, soft-bodied mortal, is set to become the queen of the eastern seaboard, every ambitious lord and lady in my court will attempt to assassinate you, to nullify the bond and claim my throne. Lord Harrington of the Manhattan Territory has been waiting for an excuse to stage a violent coup for a century. You are currently the biggest, most vulnerable target in the entire supernatural world. He walked back over to her, his towering frame casting a massive, intimidating shadow over her chair. But when he spoke again, some of the harsh, cutting edge had miraculously vanished from his voice, replaced by a strange, begrudging respect. You survived the Dance de Song, Josephine. You prove that you possess an incredible, undeniable resilience hidden beneath that infuriatingly fragile human exterior. Now you are going to have to prove that you can survive my court. Nathaniel extended his freezing hand to her once more, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. Welcome to your new life, my queen. Try not to get us both killed before Thursday. The morning sun completely failed to penetrate the heavily fortified blackout velvet curtains of the master suite in the Croft estate. Josephine Miller awoke with a violently sudden gasp, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs as the terrifying memories of the previous night crashed down upon her consciousness. She was hopelessly trapped in a gargantuan, impossibly lavish bed that felt more like a silken ocean than a piece of furniture. The sheets were woven from Egyptian cotton, so fine it felt like spun water against her skin, a jarring contrast to the cheap, scratchy polyester blends she was accustomed to in her small Pawtucket apartment. The monumental reality of her situation settled over her with suffocating weight. She was magically, inescapably bound to Nathaniel Croft, the terrifying vampire king of the eastern seaboard. If she fled, she would magically incinerate. If she stayed, she was the prime target for an entire hidden society of bloodthirsty aristocrats desperate to usurp her newfound entirely unwanted throne. Pushing herself up against the massive, tufted headboard, Josephine nervously surveyed her temporary prison. The suite was an overwhelming display of ruthless, immortal wealth. Priceless Renaissance tapestries adorned the walls, depicting violent, bloody hunting scenes that did nothing to soothe her racing nerves. A massive, roaring fireplace, constructed entirely of imported Italian black marble, dominated the far wall, providing the only illumination in the dark, temperature-controlled room. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. Vampires, she remembered from her extensive archival studies, required deep, death-like rest during the daylight hours, retreating to heavily guarded subterranean chambers beneath the estate to protect themselves from the lethal effects of ultraviolet radiation. She was utterly alone, a fragile human temporarily abandoned in a terrifying fortress of predators. A sudden, sharp knock violently interrupted the oppressive silence, causing Josephine to instinctively flinch. Before she could cautiously respond, the heavy mahogany door smoothly opened. A woman stepped into the dimly lit suite, moving with the terrifying predatory grace that Josephine was quickly learning to associate with the immortal elite. She was tall, with sharply angled features, striking silver blonde hair, pulled back into a severe practical knot, and completely devoid of the haughty, fashionable vanity that Camilla had aggressively displayed. She wore a tailored black tactical suit, heavily armed with silver-plated daggers strapped completely openly to her thighs. "Good morning, Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice a clipped, heavily accented, completely emotionless monotone. "I am Valerie. The king has personally assigned me as your primary daylight guardian and tactical liaison. You are to remain entirely within this suite until sundown. The estate is currently on absolute lockdown." Josephine swung her legs over the edge of the massive mattress, pulling the thick velvet comforter tightly around her shoulders like a makeshift shield. "A tactical liaison?" she echoed, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound brave. "Is that a polite, politically correct term for a prison warden?" "It is a completely accurate term for someone whose sole, entirely stressful responsibility is keeping you breathing for the next 60 hours, Valerie replied flatly, stepping further into the room and critically scanning the dark corners for any hidden threats. "Lord Harrington of the Manhattan Territory has already mobilized his political allies. Rumors of your miraculous survival of the Midnight Waltz and the subsequent activation of the ancient marital magic have spread through the supernatural underworld faster than a highly contagious plague. Harrington views your profound human vulnerability as Nathaniel's ultimate fatal weakness. He will undoubtedly attempt to orchestrate an assassination before the blood exchange ceremony can permanently solidify the mystical bond." Valerie smoothly gestured toward a heavily laden silver cart positioned near the seating area. "I have brought you human sustenance. A mortal chef from the renowned Balthazar Bakery in New York was discreetly flown in before dawn to prepare your meals under extreme, heavily armed supervision. Eat. You will require tremendous physical strength to survive the coming nights." Josephine cautiously approached the silver cart. Her stomach emitted a loud, entirely unroyal rumble. The aroma of freshly baked butter croissants, perfectly poached eggs, and rich imported Colombian coffee was incredibly distracting. She reached out her fingers, brushing against the handle of an ornate silver teapot. However, her extensive years as a dedicated, incredibly observant archivist suddenly triggered a massive, glaring alarm in her brain. She froze completely. The silver teapot was wrong. Josephine closely examined the intricate winding floral patterns violently etched into the incredibly expensive metal. The Croft family crest, which she had meticulously catalogued on hundreds of historical documents, was subtly inverted, the tiny roaring lion facing the left instead of the right. It was a minuscule, almost invisible error, but to someone whose entire career relied entirely upon noticing historical discrepancies, it was a gigantic flashing neon sign of profound danger. She immediately recognized the alternate crest. It belonged to the Harrington lineage, a rival family that had aggressively attempted to seize control of the lucrative Boston shipping lanes in the late 19th century. "Valerie," Josephine said softly, her voice entirely devoid of panic but tight with absolute certainty. "Do not touch this cart. Do not let anyone else touch this cart." The vampire guard instantly went perfectly still, her hand flying instinctively to the silver dagger strapped to her thigh. "Explain immediately." The teapot, Josephine pointed frantically, taking several large aggressive steps backward, away from the breakfast spread. "The family crest is completely wrong. It is the Harrington seal, heavily disguised to look like the Croft crest. This card did not come from your heavily armed kitchen. Someone entirely else brought this into the suite." Valerie's eyes narrowed into incredibly dangerous glowing slits. She moved with terrifying, blinding speed, snatching a small, seemingly innocent blueberry muffin from the silver tray and forcefully tossing it directly into the roaring black marble fireplace. The exact moment the pastry violently struck the burning logs, the flames erupted into a massive, blinding flash of toxic, aggressive green light, violently hissing and spitting thick, incredibly foul-smelling black smoke into the pristine suite. It was heavily laced with a lethal, highly concentrated dose of refined wolfsbane and completely pulverized silver glass, a vicious combination designed to violently destroy a human digestive tract and completely melt a vampire from the inside out. Valerie slowly turned to look at Josephine, her previously entirely stoic expression replaced by a look of profound, entirely genuine shock and newfound undeniable respect. You noticed a millimeter discrepancy on a silver teapot from 5 feet away, the immortal guard whispered incredibly softly. I am a professional archivist, Josephine replied shakily, heavily, sinking into a nearby velvet chair and wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach. My entire job is literally noticing the tremendously tiny, incredibly dangerous things that arrogant, overly confident immortals violently overlook. When the sun completely vanished beneath the distant Rhode Island horizon, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere within the Croft estate instantly shifted from tense, guarded silence to highly aggressive, terrifyingly kinetic energy. The massive, heavily reinforced mahogany door to Josephine's suite burst completely open, violently slamming against the ancient stone wall. Nathaniel Croft marched aggressively into the room, looking like a terrifying, vengeful god of war. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his obsidian eyes burned with an incredibly violent, uncontrollable rage that caused the temperature in the entire room to plummet tremendously to freezing levels. Valerie immediately dropped to one knee, deeply bowing her head in absolute terrified reverence. Leave us! Nathaniel snarled, his deep velvet voice violently vibrating with lethal intent. Valerie instantly vanished into the dark shadows, heavily closing the shattered door behind her. Nathaniel crossed the massive room in 3 incredibly long, terrifyingly fast strides, entirely eliminating the physical distance between himself and Josephine. He stopped mere inches away from her, his chest heavily heaving as he stared down at the soft, completely uninjured mortal woman standing defiantly in front of him. He violently reached out, completely ignoring her instinctive flinch, and tightly gripped her shoulders, his freezing fingers frantically scanning her skin to ensure she was entirely unharmed by the morning's incredibly violent assassination attempt. I completely underestimated Harrington's utter desperation. Nathaniel breathed heavily, his voice surprisingly ragged, violently betraying a level of immense, terrifying panic that he absolutely never displayed to his ruthless court. He bribed a daytime servant to switch the cards. The traitor has already been completely, entirely dealt with, but it absolutely should never have happened. If you had ingested even a tremendous fraction of that poisoned food, your completely fragile human heart would have violently exploded instantly, taking me straight to hell alongside you. Josephine firmly pushed his cold hands away from her shoulders, refusing to be treated like a completely helpless, tremendously delicate piece of highly fragile glass. I completely handled it, Nathaniel. I am fully aware that my physical body does not completely match your highly arrogant, incredibly shallow standard of immortal, emaciated perfection. But my tremendously capable brain works perfectly fine. I am absolutely not a completely helpless victim. Nathaniel remained completely silent for a very long, intensely charged moment. The sheer tremendous rage in his glowing obsidian eyes slowly faded, entirely replaced by a profound, incredibly complex emotion that looked terrifyingly similar to genuine awe. He slowly backed away, dragging his pale hands heavily down his striking face. He was the undisputed king, an immortal tactician who had violently ruled for centuries, completely unchallenged. Yet this completely ordinary, heavily built mortal woman from Pawtucket had effortlessly outsmarted an incredibly deadly assassination plot that his own highly trained security force had completely failed to detect. You are continuously, tremendously surprising me, Josephine, Nathaniel heavily admitted, his voice significantly softening, losing the terrifying, aggressive edge. You possess a tremendously fierce, undeniably brilliant intellect. I publicly mocked your tremendously soft form because I am entirely accustomed to a completely brutal society where physical weakness is instantly, violently punished. But I am rapidly, entirely learning that your tremendous, undeniable strength simply resides completely elsewhere. Josephine crossed her arms completely defensively over her heavily curved chest, absolutely refusing to easily accept his incredibly rare compliment. Don't suddenly try to violently flatter me just because my tremendous archival skills completely saved your immortal life today. We still absolutely have to figure out how to successfully survive this tremendously horrific blood exchange ceremony tomorrow night. Nathaniel slowly nodded, turning to forcefully gaze deeply into the roaring black marble fireplace. The ceremony is incredibly intimate, profoundly dangerous, and absolutely permanent. It completely requires both participants to be entirely willing. The ancient magic actively feeds heavily on genuine submission and absolute trust. If you continuously harbor profound, tremendous terror or massive hatred toward me when our blood finally mixes, the magical bond will violently reject us, entirely incinerating us both on the grand altar. He heavily turned back to intensely face her. The flickering, incredibly bright orange firelight heavily highlighted the sharp, terrifyingly beautiful angles of his pale face. I absolutely need you to completely, entirely trust me, Josephine. I completely understand that I tremendously behaved like an absolute arrogant monster last night, but right now we are entirely permanently bound in this tremendously deadly game. I will entirely protect you from Harrington. I will absolutely protect you from Camilla, but I entirely need your complete, tremendous cooperation. Before Josephine could completely formulate a tremendously sharp, heavily defensive response, a soft, incredibly polite knock politely interrupted the intense, suffocating tension. A tremendously famous, highly exclusive mortal designer named Dominique quietly entered the room, heavily accompanied by 3 highly terrified, heavily laden assistants, furiously carrying massive, incredibly bulky garment bags. Dominique was entirely aware of the supernatural underworld, having heavily catered to the incredibly demanding, tremendously terrifying immortal elite for completely over 3 decades. Your Majesty, Dominique deeply bowed heavily, avoiding making any direct eye contact with the terrifying king. I have completely brought the tremendously urgent garments for the profoundly critical ceremony tomorrow evening exactly as you heavily requested. Nathaniel heavily gestured toward the completely overwhelmed designer. I entirely took the tremendous liberty of heavily ordering something tremendously appropriate for your newly acquired, completely elevated station. The cheap, incredibly stiff taffeta you heavily wore yesterday is entirely, completely unacceptable for a tremendously powerful queen. Josephine cautiously, heavily stepped forward as Dominique furiously unzipped the largest, tremendously heavy garment bag. The dress inside was an absolute, completely breathtaking masterpiece of incredibly intricate, heavily detailed craftsmanship. It was a tremendously deep, incredibly rich shade of heavily dark crimson, entirely constructed from layers of incredibly expensive, tremendously soft silk, and entirely covered in heavily intricate, incredibly delicate black lace, heavily imported directly from ancient Venice. It completely possessed a heavily structured, tremendously supportive bodice, specifically designed to entirely accentuate and beautifully flatter her heavy curves, entirely paired with a massive, incredibly sweeping skirt, heavily designed to completely command immense, terrifying authority. It is entirely, completely beautiful, Josephine heavily whispered, gently touching the tremendously soft, incredibly luxurious fabric. For the very first time in her incredibly difficult, heavily stressful life, she wasn't entirely being aggressively shoved into a tremendously shapeless, highly unflattering dark tent designed to entirely hide her massive body. This completely incredible dress was heavily designed to tremendously celebrate her entirely, absolutely as she was. She slowly turned to look at Nathaniel, her tremendous, highly defensive walls completely lowering just a fraction of an inch. He was completely intensely staring at her, entirely ignoring the incredibly beautiful dress. His highly terrifying, tremendously dark eyes were completely, entirely focused heavily on her completely flushed, undeniably alive human face. You will absolutely look entirely terrifying, completely magnificent, Nathaniel softly promised, his deep, heavily velvet voice completely wrapping around her like a tremendously warm, incredibly heavy blanket. Tomorrow night, when you entirely stand before my highly treacherous, heavily judgmental court, they will absolutely never completely mock you ever again. You will entirely command them, and then we will entirely bleed together. The profoundly absolute, incredibly heavy weight of his terrifying promise hung entirely thick in the highly suffocating, incredibly tense air. The tremendously deadly blood exchange entirely awaited them, and Josephine entirely knew her completely ordinary, highly mortal life was entirely, absolutely over forever. The heavily fortified iron doors of the deeply hidden, entirely subterranean cathedral groaned violently as they slowly, heavily swung open. Valerie remained completely close to Josephine, her highly polished, entirely silver daggers beautifully catching the wildly flickering, incredibly dim light of the ancient, magically fueled torches lining the heavily damp, incredibly cold stone walls. Josephine wore the absolutely breathtaking, entirely custom crimson silk and highly intricate black lace gown that Dominique had meticulously constructed in mere hours. The incredibly heavy, perfectly boned corset entirely supported her soft waist, while the tremendously voluminous, highly expensive skirts swept majestically over the entirely freezing, incredibly ancient stone floor. She entirely looked like a tremendously terrifying, absolutely magnificent goddess of dark blood and heavy shadow, completely transforming from a deeply frightened, highly marginalized historical archivist into a tremendously commanding, undeniably powerful, and absolute queen. The massive, heavy oak doors at the completely far end of the incredibly long, highly decorated corridor violently swung completely open, entirely revealing a tremendously massive, incredibly cavernous underground cathedral completely filled with many hundreds of ancient, highly terrifying, immortal aristocrats. The tremendously suffocating, incredibly heavy silence instantly fell completely over the heavily gathered, highly elite crowd as Josephine bravely stepped completely over the ancient stone threshold. Nathaniel entirely stood completely still at the tremendously far end of the incredibly vast, entirely dark room, heavily waiting quietly beside a tremendously massive, violently carved, dark obsidian sacrificial altar. He entirely wore a completely tailored, absolutely perfect black velvet formal suit, his incredibly dark, highly terrifying eyes instantly locking completely onto her soft face with a tremendously terrifying, entirely consuming, highly passionate intensity. Josephine completely felt a tremendously profound, incredibly heavy weight suddenly settle deeply within her actively beating human chest. This entirely was the absolute, completely undeniable final point of no completely possible return, as she slowly, purposefully walked entirely down the incredibly long, beautifully carpeted center aisle. The highly terrified, completely shocked, surrounding ancient vampires practically violently pressed their cold bodies entirely against the heavily damp, ancient stone cathedral walls. Their tremendously sharp, highly predatory, pale faces were completely entirely drained of the highly arrogant, deeply cruel mockery they had so aggressively, terribly displayed only 2 short, highly stressful nights prior. They entirely stared directly at her completely transformed, tremendously majestic, highly commanding appearance with absolute, completely undeniable, entirely silent shock. Josephine heavily kept her soft chin entirely held completely high, absolutely refusing to entirely break her direct eye contact with the highly terrifying, incredibly powerful immortal king, deeply waiting for her completely at the dark obsidian altar. However, precisely just as she entirely reached the absolute halfway point of the tremendously massive, incredibly ancient underground cathedral, a completely sudden, violently aggressive, highly terrifying commotion entirely erupted completely near the heavy, ancient wooden entrance doors. Lord Harrington, a tremendously, terrifyingly tall, incredibly gaunt, ancient vampire, with completely stark white hair and heavily, terribly scarred, pale cheeks, violently, aggressively pushed his entire body completely through the tightly, heavily packed, immortal crowd. He was entirely furiously flanked by exactly 6 heavily armed, incredibly massive, entirely terrifying mercenary vampire guards. Halt this entirely fraudulent, completely illegal ceremony instantly. Harrington violently aggressively roared, his deeply echoing, highly terrifying voice completely violently shattering the heavily tense, incredibly profound silence. Nathaniel entirely instantly bared his tremendously, terrifyingly sharp, highly dangerous white fangs, his entire immortal body violently, completely tensing with absolute, entirely uncontrollable, deeply murderous rage as he stepped completely aggressively directly in front of the highly carved dark obsidian altar. You tremendously, absolutely overstep your established territorial boundaries, Lord Harrington. This highly sacred, incredibly ancient ceremony is entirely, absolutely protected by the tremendously powerful, deeply ancient blood magic Harrington entirely let out a completely dark, heavily mocking, tremendously cruel laugh, stepping completely aggressively entirely toward the heavily breathing, completely stationary Josephine. The deeply ancient, highly powerful magic entirely requires both participating individuals to be completely, entirely, absolutely willing. Lord Croft, this highly pathetic, completely terrified, incredibly soft human woman, is entirely, completely a highly valuable political hostage. She absolutely does not completely, entirely understand the tremendously terrifying, deeply immortal, highly permanent reality of the highly sacred blood exchange. If she entirely takes the incredibly dark bite entirely out of absolute complete terror, the tremendously ancient magic will violently, instantly incinerate you entirely. Both I am simply entirely saving the highly valuable eastern seaboard from completely losing its ruling king to a terribly, incredibly misguided, entirely pathetic, completely fatal mistake. Harrington violently, aggressively lunged completely toward the heavily standing Josephine, deeply intending to entirely, violently drag her completely away from the highly sacred altar and permanently, entirely disrupt the deeply necessary, highly magical, complete submission clause. Valerie entirely, instantly drew her heavily polished silver daggers, violently, heavily intercepting two of the incredibly massive, entirely terrifying mercenaries, but Harrington completely, entirely bypassed her highly defensive block. His razor-sharp, incredibly long, dark talons extending rapidly, violently, as he entirely aggressively reached completely for Josephine's incredibly fragile, highly soft human throat. Nathaniel completely moved with entirely blinding, absolutely impossible, highly supernatural speed, entirely crossing the tremendously massive physical distance in a completely microscopic fraction of a highly brief second, but Harrington had tremendously, entirely anticipated the deeply violent, highly aggressive, immortal counterattack. He violently, entirely threw a tremendously massive, heavily cursed, highly enchanted, bright silver tactical net entirely directly at the charging, deeply furious king. The incredibly heavy, violently burning, cursed metal entirely wrapped completely around Nathaniel, completely, entirely pinning his massive body directly to the absolutely freezing, heavily damp, ancient stone floor. The deeply furious king violently, aggressively roared in absolute, entirely complete agony as the deeply, heavily cursed, bright silver instantly, violently began aggressively burning completely through his highly expensive black velvet suit and heavily, violently scorching his pale, deeply immortal flesh. Josephine was completely, entirely, absolutely unprotected. Harrington violently, aggressively grabbed her tremendously heavy, highly delicate black lace sleeve, his tremendously, terrifyingly cold, violently sharp, dark claws digging entirely deeply into her completely warm, entirely soft human arm. "You are entirely, completely coming directly with me, you absolutely pathetic, tremendously heavy, incredibly fragile mortal," Harrington violently, entirely sneered, violently, heavily, yanking her completely, entirely backward. "The highly powerful, tremendously valuable ruling throne of Boston completely, entirely belongs directly to my deeply ancient, highly superior, immortal bloodline." But Josephine completely, entirely remembered the deeply ingrained, highly intense, incredibly powerful physical muscle memory entirely from her highly competitive, tremendously demanding past ballroom dancing days. She entirely, completely anticipated his highly aggressive, deeply violent, entirely sudden physical pull. Instead of hopelessly, entirely resisting his tremendously absolute, highly unnatural, deeply immortal physical strength, she entirely, completely shifted her highly criticized, tremendously heavy, incredibly solid human weight completely, entirely forward. She aggressively, violently drove her entirely sensible, highly sturdy black heel violently, completely down directly into the incredibly fragile, highly sensitive, completely unprotected central arch of Harrington's expensive leather-clad left foot as the highly arrogant, completely shocked ancient vampire momentarily, entirely gasped in completely unexpected, entirely highly sudden physical pain. Josephine violently, completely twisted her entirely heavy, perfectly supported upper body. She entirely, completely threw her highly massive, entirely heavy human elbow completely, violently backward. The brutally, entirely solid physical strike entirely, completely connected directly with the tremendously sharp, highly angular, entirely pale bridge of Harrington's incredibly arrogant nose. It violently, completely shattered the highly ancient, deeply brittle, immortal bone with a completely, highly satisfying, incredibly loud, entirely disgusting cracking sound. The completely, entirely stunned rebel lord violently, completely stumbled heavily backward, his pale hands frantically, entirely flying directly to his heavily, violently bleeding, entirely ruined face. Josephine aggressively, completely ripped her entirely, violently torn black lace sleeve completely, entirely out of his highly terrifying, deeply cold, immortal grasp. She violently, quickly scrambled entirely, completely forward, aggressively, entirely diving completely directly toward the desperately, highly struggling, deeply burning immortal king. She violently, entirely grabbed the heavily cursed, completely burning, highly enchanted, bright silver net entirely with her completely bare, incredibly soft human hands. The incredibly powerful, completely dark, highly destructive magic instantly, violently seared her soft, highly vulnerable human palms, but she completely, entirely ignored the tremendous, highly blinding, entirely absolute physical agony. She violently, completely ripped the tremendously heavy, entirely burning, incredibly dangerous magical mesh entirely, completely off Nathaniel's heavily scorched, entirely ruined broad shoulders. The deeply furious king was entirely, completely freed. Nathaniel instantly, violently surged entirely upward with highly terrifying, absolutely complete, entirely lethal, supernatural violence. He brutally, entirely seized the highly treacherous, completely bleeding Harrington directly by his heavily ruined, completely shattered throat. He violently, entirely lifted the deeply treacherous, entirely shocked rebel lord completely, entirely off the freezing, incredibly damp, ancient stone floor. The tremendously massive, deeply underground cathedral instantly, entirely erupted directly into completely absolute, entirely highly terrifying total chaos as the highly loyal, completely heavily armed royal guards violently, aggressively descended entirely upon the deeply treacherous, completely outnumbered mercenary vampires. Nathaniel's incredibly dark, highly terrifying obsidian eyes, completely, entirely burned with a tremendously, highly terrifying, incredibly lethal, completely absolute, dark, demonic fire. He entirely, completely tightened his incredibly freezing, highly marble-like, tremendously powerful physical grip entirely around Harrington's desperately, completely thrashing, highly vulnerable neck. You absolutely, entirely dared to violently touch my completely chosen, highly powerful, entirely permanent queen. Nathaniel violently, deeply hissed his heavily velvet, tremendously dark voice, entirely echoing completely through the incredibly massive, deeply chaotic, ancient stone room. With one completely single, highly brutal, entirely effortless, incredibly violent physical twist, Nathaniel completely, entirely snapped the deeply ancient, highly arrogant rebel lord's completely fragile, immortal neck. Harrington's entirely lifeless, completely ruined, pale body violently, heavily dropped completely onto the incredibly freezing, highly ancient, damp stone floor. The entirely chaotic, highly violent fighting completely, entirely ceased exactly in that tremendously specific, highly terrifying, exact moment. The remaining completely terrified mercenary vampires instantly, entirely dropped their highly heavy, entirely silver-plated tactical weapons, violently, completely falling entirely to their highly trembling, completely defeated knees, in absolutely total, entirely, highly complete, unconditional surrender. Nathaniel slowly, entirely turned directly back to entirely, completely face the deeply, heavily breathing, entirely, completely exhausted Josephine. Her deeply warm, incredibly soft human hands were completely, entirely blistered and heavily, violently burned from the incredibly cursed, highly dangerous silver magical net. Yet she entirely, completely stood, absolutely, perfectly, tremendously tall, and completely, entirely, undeniably resolute. She had entirely, completely, absolutely proven her tremendously, highly incredible, entirely unyielding human worth to the deeply skeptical, highly terrifying, immortal court. Nathaniel entirely, completely, gently reached completely out, carefully, softly, taking her heavily, violently burned, deeply injured human hands completely into his entirely, completely freezing, highly powerful, immortal grasp. The completely deep, entirely, highly terrifyingly raw emotion shining entirely inside his completely, incredibly dark, highly ancient obsidian eyes was completely, entirely undeniable, entirely, highly absolute, genuine love, and tremendously, highly deep, entirely complete, profound respect. Are you entirely, completely, absolutely sure you truly, entirely wish to completely proceed with this highly permanent, entirely, deeply ancient, sacred bond, my highly, tremendously, incredibly brave, completely, absolutely, completely fierce, entirely, heavily human queen, Nathaniel? deeply, softly, entirely, highly, completely, gently, asked, entirely, completely, dropping his completely, highly terrifying, entirely, heavily royal guard. Josephine entirely, completely, absolutely looked deeply, entirely, directly into the incredibly, highly, completely ancient, entirely, heavily, deeply dark, obsidian eyes of the entirely, absolutely, completely terrifying vampire king. She completely, entirely, deeply knew that her completely, absolutely, entirely, highly mortal, completely, heavily, completely ordinary life was entirely, absolutely, completely, highly, permanently, entirely, deeply, absolutely over forever. Yet, entirely, completely, highly, absolute, deep within her, entirely, heavily, completely human heart, she completely, entirely, absolutely, highly felt entirely, completely ready. She entirely, absolutely, completely, slowly, entirely, heavily, completely nodded her entirely, completely, absolutely human head. I am entirely, completely, absolutely, entirely, completely ready, she deeply, entirely, completely, softly, completely whispered. Nathaniel entirely, completely, absolutely, completely, deeply leaned entirely, entirely forward, and entirely, completely, absolutely, carefully, entirely, completely, highly, gently sank his completely, entirely, highly sharp, entirely, absolutely, completely, entirely immortal white fangs deeply, entirely, absolutely, completely, entirely into the entirely, absolutely, completely, highly, entirely warm, completely, absolutely, entirely soft, entirely, highly human flesh of her entirely, completely, absolutely, highly, entirely delicate human neck, the entirely, completely, absolutely, highly ancient, entirely, completely, absolutely, deeply powerful, entirely, completely, absolutely, highly blood magic, entirely, completely, absolutely, violently, entirely, completely flared, entirely, absolutely, brightly, entirely, completely throughout the entirely, completely, absolutely, deeply massive, entirely, absolutely ancient, entirely, entirely stone, entirely, absolute cathedral, entirely, completely sealing their entirely, absolutely, highly, entirely, absolute, entirely fate forever. Josephine's journey from an invisible mocked archivist to the undeniable queen of the eastern seaboard proves that true power does not come from hollow immortal perfection, but from the unyielding fire of the human spirit. She didn't just survive the treacherous vampire court, she absolutely conquered it. What did you think of Josephine's incredible physical transformation and Nathaniel's surprising fierce devotion? If you love this thrilling vampire romance drama and want to uncover more epic tales of dangerous love, betrayal, and dark magic, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel today.